Jonah Redfeather stood in the Tombstone Depot, dust swirling around his boots, waiting for the woman he'd bought through a letter, a stranger meant to save his dying ranch. When the train hissed to a stop and Clara Wren stepped onto the platform, every head turned. She wasn't plain, she wasn't invisible, and the polished banker watching from the shadows wore a smile that promised ruin. Jonah didn't know it yet, but the desert had just delivered something far more dangerous than drought. A woman worth fighting for, and a man who'd come to claim her as payment for a debt she never owed. Welcome to a story of survival, defiance, and the kind of love that grows in the hardest soil. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The Arizona Territory didn't forgive weakness. Jonah Redfeather had learned that truth the hard way, carved into his skin by sun and loss, and the slow, relentless crumbling of everything he'd tried to build. He stood at the edge of his land in the failing light of late afternoon, watching the dust devils spin across cracked earth that hadn't seen real rain in 4 months. The cattle were lean, ribs showing through hide. The well was dropping another foot every week, and the town of Tombstone, 3 miles south, treated him like a ghost, present but unseen, tolerated only because his money spent the same as anyone else's. He was 34 years old, half Apache, half something else he'd never bothered to name. His mother's people had called him Hashkenyahodi, he who walks angry, before the fever took her when he was 12. His father, a drifter with Irish blood and a talent for disappearing, had left nothing but a last name that didn't fit, and a homestead claim Jonah had fought to keep for 2 decades. The ranch sat in a valley between red rock mesas, 160 acres of stubborn earth that yielded just enough to keep a man alive if he worked every daylight hour, and most of the dark ones. Jonah had built the house himself, rough-hewn logs chinked with adobe, a stone fireplace that drew smoke clean, windows facing east to catch the morning sun. He'd raised horses here once, good ones, until the Apache Wars drove prices down and white buyers stopped trusting a man with his mother's cheekbones. Now he ran a small herd of cattle, grew what vegetables the climate allowed, and tried not to think about the family he'd lost 3 years back. Sarah had been white, a teacher's daughter from Tucson, with soft hands and a laugh that could pull him out of the darkest moods. She'd married him despite her father's rage, despite the stares in town, despite knowing what it meant to tie herself to a man the territory would never fully accept. For 2 years they'd been happy, genuinely, impossibly happy. And then the influenza came through in the winter of 1884, and Sarah died in his arms on a January night so cold the water in the basin froze solid. The baby, a girl, barely 6 months old, followed her mother 4 days later. Jonah had buried them on the hill behind the house, under a cottonwood that was dying now from the same drought killing everything else. He didn't visit the graves anymore. Couldn't stand the way the wind sounded through the bare branches, like something crying. After that, he'd stopped trying to connect, stopped going to the church socials Sarah had loved, stopped making conversation at the mercantile, stopped pretending he belonged anywhere but on his own land with his own silence. The town had been happy to oblige. Tombstone was booming in those days, silver money flowing, saloons packed, decent women clutching their skirts aside when a half-breed walked past. Jonah had become exactly what they expected, a hard man on a failing ranch, spoken to only when necessity demanded it. But the drought changed everything. By the summer of 1887, the land was turning to dust. The cattle were dying, the well was failing, and Jonah realized, with the cold clarity of a man staring at his own extinction, that he couldn't do it alone anymore. He needed help, real help, the kind that didn't leave when the work got hard or the money ran thin. He needed a wife, not a romance, not a companion, just a partner strong enough to survive what the desert threw at them, and stubborn enough to stay when it got brutal. He sat at the kitchen table one August night, lamp flickering, and wrote the most honest letter he'd ever composed. To the Frontier Matrimonial Agency, San Francisco. I am a rancher in the Arizona Territory, 34 years of age, of mixed heritage. I own 160 acres outright, a house, a well, and livestock. I work hard and expect the same. I am not a drinker, not violent, and I keep my word. I need a wife. Not for sentiment, but because this land requires 2 people to survive it. I need someone plain, steady, and strong. Someone who understands work and doesn't expect softness. I will provide food, shelter, and fair treatment. Nothing more is promised. If you have a woman willing to come to Arizona under these terms, send word. Jonah Red Feather. He'd mailed it the next morning, half convinced nothing would come of it. Matrimonial agencies catered to men with money and charm, men who could offer security and status. Jonah had land and little else. His house was solid but plain. His finances were strained, and his social standing in Tombstone was somewhere below the Mexican laborers and just above the outlaws camping in the hills. But 6 weeks later, a telegram arrived at the Tombstone station. Bride. Arriving September 12th. Stop, Clara Wren, stop, age 28. Stop, expects correspondence terms honored. Stop, Patterson, agency. Jonah read it 3 times, standing in the telegraph office while the clerk watched him with undisguised curiosity. September 12th. That was 4 days away. He folded the telegram carefully, paid the fee, and walked out into the midday glare. Around him, Tombstone bustled. Miners heading for the saloons, freight wagons rattling past, women in their best dresses parading down Allen Street. No one looked at him. No one ever did, unless they needed something or wanted to make sure he knew his place. Jonah didn't care. His mind was already turning over the logistics. 4 days to prepare the house, to make sure there was food enough for 2, to figure out how to explain to a stranger that she was coming to the hardest life imaginable and the loneliest. He bought supplies, flour, coffee, salt pork, dried beans. He repaired the broken hinge on the bedroom door, swept the floors, washed the windows until they caught light cleanly. He didn't know what Clara Wren looked like, didn't know her story, or why a woman would answer a letter as blunt as his. He only knew she was coming, and that meant he had to be ready. On the night of September 11th, he sat on the porch and watched the stars come out over the mesas. The air was finally cooling, the brutal heat of summer easing into the long relief of autumn. Somewhere out there, a woman was traveling toward him, toward this failing ranch, this hard land, this life he could barely explain to himself. He wondered if she'd last a week. The train pulled into Tombstone at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, belching steam and cinders into the dry air. Jonah stood on the platform, hat pulled low, watching passengers disembark with the detached interest of a man waiting for freight. He'd come alone. Hadn't told anyone he was collecting a bride. Hadn't invited witnesses or well-wishers. This was a transaction, plain and practical, and he saw no reason to dress it up. The first passengers off were miners, dust-caked and loud, heading straight for the nearest saloon. Then came a family, mother, father, 3 children clutching cloth bundles, a businessman in a suit too fine for Arizona heat, an older woman with a birdcage. And then Clara Wren stepped onto the platform. Jonah felt the air shift. She wasn't plain. She wasn't invisible. She was tall, nearly 5'8", with dark auburn hair pinned in a neat coil beneath a simple gray bonnet. Her traveling dress was dove-colored wool, modest and well-made, the hem dusted but not ragged. She carried a single carpet bag and a leather satchel, both worn but cared for. Her face was striking in a way that had nothing to do with softness. Strong bones, clear hazel eyes, a mouth set in a line that suggested she'd learned not to expect easy welcomes. She looked directly at him, and every other man on the platform looked at her. Jonah felt the shift in attention like a physical thing. The miners paused mid-step. The businessman's gaze lingered. Even the station master, a man who'd known Jonah for years and never acknowledged him beyond necessity, stared openly. Clara ignored them all. She walked straight to Jonah, set her bags down, and extended a gloved hand. "Mr. Redfeather?" Her voice was low, clear, with an accent that suggested eastern cities and education. Not what he'd expected. Not what he'd asked for. "Ma'am." He took her hand briefly. Her grip was firm. "You're Clara Wren." "I am." She studied him with the same directness he was using on her. "Your letter said plain, steady, and strong. I'm 2 of those 3, at least." A ghost of humor touched her eyes, gone so fast he might have imagined it. "You brought light," Jonah said, nodding at her bags. It wasn't a question. "Everything I own." Clara Clara glanced around the platform, taking in the town beyond. False-fronted buildings, dusty streets, the raw sprawl of a place built on silver and stubborn hope. It's smaller than I expected. You expected bigger? I expected nothing. She looked back at him. I've learned not to. Jonah studied her a moment longer, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the blunt specifications he'd sent to the agency. She wasn't what he'd asked for. She was too polished, too striking, too likely to draw exactly the kind of attention he'd wanted to avoid. But she was here, and standing on the tombstone platform, refusing to flinch under the stares of a dozen men who saw her as either curiosity or opportunity, she looked steady enough. "Wagons this way," Jonah said. He picked up her bags before she could protest and led her through the crowd. Behind them, he heard the murmurs start, whispers and speculation, the kind of gossip that would be all over Tombstone by nightfall. Half-breed rancher and a lady from back east. What's she thinking? How long before she runs? Clara heard it too. He could tell by the slight stiffening of her spine, the way her chin lifted just a fraction. But she didn't slow down, didn't look back. She followed him to the wagon, a sturdy flatbed hitched to 2 patient horses, and waited while he loaded her bags. When he offered a hand to help her up, she took it without hesitation and settled onto the bench seat with the ease of someone used to adapting. Jonah climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked the horses into motion. They rode in silence through Tombstone's main street. Allen Street was packed as always, saloons roaring, vendors hawking, the smell of horses and humanity thick in the heat. Clara watched it all with quiet attention, her hands folded in her lap, her expression giving away nothing. It wasn't until they left the town behind, heading north into open country, that she finally spoke. "Your letter was honest," Clara said. "I appreciated that. Didn't see the point in lying." "Most men do." She glanced at him. "They promise comfort, security, gentle lives. Then the woman arrives and finds a shack, debt, and a man who thinks marriage means ownership." Jonah heard the weight behind those words. "You've seen that before." "I've heard the stories." Clara's gaze returned to the landscape, red rock mesas rising in the distance, scrub brush and dust stretching endlessly. "I decided if I was going to take the risk, I'd rather do it with someone who told the truth from the start." "The truth is the land's failing," Jonah said flatly. "Droughts killing the cattle, wells dropping, and I can't keep it running alone. You'll work harder than you probably ever have. The house is plain, the town doesn't like me, and there's no guarantee we'll make it through the winter." "Then why bring me here?" "Because 2 people have a chance. 1 doesn't." Clara nodded slowly. "That's honest enough." They rode another mile in silence. The sun was starting its descent, painting the mesas in shades of amber and rust. The heat was easing, the air smelling of dust and creosote and something green from the distant hills. "I should tell you," Clara said quietly, "I'm not running from scandal. I'm not pregnant, not fleeing debt, not hiding from the law." "Didn't figure you were." "Then what did you figure?" Jonah considered the question. "Figured you had your reasons, same as me." Clara studied him again, and this time he felt the full weight of her intelligence behind those hazel eyes. She was measuring him, testing whether he meant what he said. "My reasons are my own," she said finally. "But they don't involve deception. I'll work, I'll keep my word, and I'll pull my weight. That's what you asked for. That's what I'll give." "Fair enough. And I have one condition." Jonah glanced at her. "What's that?" "You don't ask about my past unless I offer it, and I don't ask about yours unless you offer it first." It was the most reasonable thing anyone had said to him in years. "Deal," Jonah said. Clara extended her hand again. This time, when Jonah shook it, the gesture felt less like introduction and more like contract. 2 people agreeing to survive together, no illusions, no false promises. They rode the rest of the way in companionable quiet. The ranch appeared as the sun touched the horizon, bathing everything in red-gold light. The house sat squat and solid against the mesa backdrop, smoke rising from the chimney where Jonah had left a fire banked that morning. The barn leaned slightly to the east but held strong. Corrals enclosed a few dozen cattle, their calls carrying across the still air. A vegetable garden, mostly withered, clung to life near the well. Clara took it in without comment. Jonah pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and climbed down. He offered his hand again. and Clara descended with the same quiet competence she'd shown all afternoon. "I'll show you inside," Jonah said. "Get you settled." He carried her bags to the porch, pushed open the door, and stepped aside to let her enter first. The interior was exactly what he'd promised, plain but solid. One main room serving as kitchen and living space, with a table, chairs, a wood-burning stove, and shelves lined with simple dishes. A bedroom off to the left, door open to show a bed with a clean quilt, a washstand, a trunk for storage. Another smaller room to the right that had once been a nursery and now held tools, supplies, and the accumulated debris of a man living alone. Clara walked through slowly, running her fingers along the table edge, peering into the bedroom, checking the stove's condition with the practiced eye of someone who knew her way around hard living. "It's clean," she said. "I'm not a slob." "I didn't assume you were." She turned to face him, standing in the center of the main room with her bonnet still pinned, her traveling dress dusty at the hem. "Where do you sleep?" "Barn loft," Jonah said, "until we figure out arrangements." Clara's expression shifted, something that might have been relief or respect, he couldn't tell. "You don't have to do that." "I do, actually. You're a stranger. You need space to decide if you're staying." "I thought this was already decided." "Nothing's decided until you say it is." Jonah set her bags just inside the bedroom door. "You take tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk about how this works. If you want to leave after that, I'll take you back to town." Clara studied him for a long moment. Then she unpinned her bonnet, set it on the table, and began unbuttoning her traveling gloves. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly, "but I appreciate the option." Jonah nodded. He moved to the stove, added wood, and started preparing a simple meal: salt pork, beans, cornbread from dough he'd mixed that morning. Clara watched him work, then stepped in without asking and took over slicing bread while he fried the meat. They moved around each other carefully, like two animals sharing territory for the first time, neither quite sure of boundaries but willing to test them. Dinner was plain and hot. They ate at the table without much conversation, the silence broken only by the scrape of forks on tin plates and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. When the meal was finished, Clara rose and began clearing dishes. "I'll get those," Jonah said. "We'll both get them." She was already at the basin pumping water. "If we're partners, we work as partners." Jonah didn't argue. He brought the plates to her, and together they washed and dried in efficient quiet. When the kitchen was clean, Clara excused herself to the bedroom. Jonah banked the fire, checked the doors, and stepped outside into the cool desert night. The stars were out in force, thick and bright against the black sky. Jonah stood on the porch and listened to the land settle, wind through the scrub, a coyote's distant call, the creak of the barn as wood contracted in the cooling air. He thought about the woman inside his house. She wasn't what he'd asked for, wasn't what he'd expected. She was too refined, too striking, too likely to complicate a situation he'd wanted to keep simple. But she'd shaken his hand like she meant it. She'd worked alongside him without complaint. And when he'd given her an out, she'd chosen to stay. Maybe that was enough. Jonah walked to the barn, climbed the ladder to the loft, and stretched out on the bedroll he'd laid there that morning. Through the open loft door he could see the house, lamplight glowing warm in the window, smoke curling from the chimney. For the first time in 3 years, the place didn't look quite so empty. Clara woke before dawn. The room was dark, the air cool and dry. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself. The unfamiliar bed, the rough walls, the absolute silence of a place far from cities and crowds. Then she rose, dressed in practical clothes from her bag, and stepped into the main room. Jonah was already outside. She could see him through the window, moving between the barn and the corrals, carrying buckets, checking livestock. He moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done these tasks 1,000 times. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Clara lit the stove, found coffee in a pot, and started water boiling. By the time Jonah came inside, the smell of fresh coffee filled the room. He stopped in the doorway, surprise flickering across his face. "You're up early," he said. "I'm used to early." Clara poured 2 cups, set one on the table for him. "What needs doing?" "You just got here. And you said the land requires 2 people. I'm one of them. So what needs doing?" Jonah took the coffee, drank, and studied her over the rim of the cup. Then he nodded toward the door. Cattle need checking, well needs attention. Garden's dying, but might be saved if we can rig better irrigation. Take your pick. Clara set her cup down. Show me the garden first. I know plants. They worked through the morning together. Clara proved knowledgeable about desert gardening, which crops could survive with minimal water, how to mulch to preserve moisture, where to plant for maximum shade. She wasn't afraid of dirt, wasn't afraid of sweat. She worked alongside Jonah with a quiet determination that reminded him of Sarah, though the similarities ended there. By midday, they'd salvaged half the vegetable plot and rigged a crude but functional drip system using buckets and cloth strips. It wouldn't save everything, but it gave the hardier plants a fighting chance. They broke for lunch, more beans, bread, strong coffee. Clara ate without complaint, her hands blistered from the shovel, her face flushed from the heat. You handle this better than I expected, Jonah said. Because I look soft? Because you look like you came from somewhere easier. Claire's expression went carefully neutral. Easier doesn't mean better, and looking soft doesn't mean being weak. Didn't say it did. No, you didn't. She met his eyes. I appreciate that. They returned to work. The afternoon passed in steady labor, Clara learning the rhythms of the ranch, Jonah teaching her what she needed to know without condescension. By evening, they'd accomplished more together than Jonah had managed alone in a week. That night, after another simple meal, Clara sat on the porch while Jonah checked the animals one last time. The sky was turning purple, the first stars appearing. She was exhausted in a way she hadn't been in years, honest fatigue, earned through work that mattered. Jonah returned and sat on the porch step, not too close, respecting distance. You did good today, he said. So did you. I mean it. Most people would have quit by now. Clara looked at him in the fading light. I'm not most people. Starting to see that. They sat in silence, watching darkness claim the desert. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, dry thunder, promising rain that wouldn't come. Jonah, Clara said quietly, thank you for the bedroom, for giving me choice. It's only right. Right doesn't always matter to people. She paused. It matters that it matters to you. Jonah didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But something in his chest, something that had been locked tight for 3 years, shifted slightly, letting in the smallest sliver of light. They stayed on the porch until full dark, two strangers learning to be partners, building trust, one quiet moment at a time. Neither of them noticed the rider watching from the mesa above, a man in a fine suit who'd followed Clara's train all the way from Missouri and who sat now on his horse in the shadows, studying the ranch below with cold calculation. Silas Carrington had found her, and he wasn't leaving empty-handed. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm Clara hadn't known she'd been craving. Work at first light, the desert cool and forgiving before the sun turned brutal. Breakfast together in comfortable silence, then more work, mending fence, hauling water, coaxing life from stubborn earth. Lunch was simple, dinners plain but filling. Evenings on the porch, watching the sky shift through its nightly performance of color and stars. Jonah didn't talk much, but his silences weren't hostile. They were the kind of quiet that came from a man who'd learned words, often failed where action succeeded. Clara found herself relaxing into it, grateful not to perform or explain, content to let the work speak for both of them. On the 4th morning, she woke to the sound of distant thunder. Real thunder this time, not the dry mockery that had rumbled through previous nights. Clara dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Jonah already standing in the yard, face turned toward the western sky where dark clouds were building over the mesas. Storm coming, he said without looking at her. That's good, isn't it? The drought? Depends on what kind of storm. Jonah's jaw tightened. Desert rain can be a blessing or a flood. No in between. Clara followed his gaze. The clouds were rolling in fast, bruised dark and heavy, lightning flickering in their bellies. The air had that electric quality that made her skin prickle, and the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of distant rain and ozone. What do we need to do? She asked. Jonah turned to her then, something like approval in his dark eyes. Not surprise, he was past being surprised by her competence, but a kind of recognition that she understood the nature of partnership. Cattle need to be moved to higher ground. Anything loose needs securing. And we need to check the irrigation channels. If they flood, they'll wash out everything we just fixed. Tell me where to start. They worked through the morning as the storm built overhead. Clara helped drive the cattle to a rise north of the main pasture, her voice surprisingly effective at moving the stubborn animals when Jonah's grew hoarse from shouting. She secured tools, tied down anything that might blow away, and helped Jonah reinforce the garden channels with rocks and packed earth. The first drops fell just after noon, fat and heavy, striking the dust with audible impact. Within minutes, the sky opened. Rain came down in sheets, cold and relentless, turning the parched earth into instant rivers. Clara had never seen anything like it. The sheer violence of water reclaiming desert, the way dry arroyos became torrents in seconds, the sound like a living thing roaring across the land. "Inside!" Jonah grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the house as the deluge intensified. They made it to the porch just as hail started mixing with the rain. Chunks of ice, the size of marbles, bouncing off the roof, the ground, the railings. Clara stood dripping in the doorway, breathing hard, watching the world turn into a gray curtain of water. Jonah was checking the windows, making sure they were secure, his shirt plastered to his back. Then he froze, staring out toward the barn. "Damn it!" "What?" "Goats stuck." He pointed toward the far corral, where a white shape was visible through the rain, trapped against the fence as water rose around it. "Must have spooked and got wedged, if the water keeps rising." He was already moving, grabbing his hat. "You can't go out in this," Clara said. "Can't leave her to drown either." Clara didn't think. She just followed. The rain hit like fists. Within seconds, she was soaked through, water streaming down her face, her boots squelching in mud that hadn't existed 5 minutes before. Jonah was ahead of her, wading through water that was already ankle-deep and rising. The goat, a young nanny with wild eyes, was wedged between fence posts, bleeding in terror as the flood climbed higher. Jonah reached her first, trying to pull her free, but the animal panicked and thrashed, making it worse. "Hold her head," Jonah shouted over the rain. "Keep her still!" Clara grabbed the goat's head, murmuring nonsense words while Jonah worked to free the trapped legs. The water was at their knees now, cold and pulling with surprising strength. Clara's fingers were numb, her arms shaking from the effort of holding the terrified animal, but she didn't let go. "Got it!" Jonah pulled the goat free just as a surge of water hit them both. The animal bolted for higher ground, and Jonah grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her with him as they fought their way back to the house. They collapsed on the porch, gasping, drenched, mud-splattered from head to boot. The rain continued its assault, and somewhere in the distance, Clara heard the crack of lightning striking stone. Then Jonah started laughing. It was a rusty sound, like something that hadn't been used in years and didn't quite remember how. But it was genuine, and it transformed his face, softened the hard lines, brought light to eyes that had been shadowed since the moment Clara met him. Clara found herself laughing too, the absurdity of it all hitting her at once. They'd just risked their lives for a goat in a storm that might wash away half the ranch, and somehow that seemed exactly right. "You're crazy," Jonah said, still grinning. "Following me out there." "You went first," Clara pointed out. "I'm used to crazy." "Then I guess we match." Their eyes met and something shifted between them. Not romance. Neither was ready for that. Might never be ready. But a recognition deeper than attraction. They'd just fought together against something bigger than both of them, and they'd won. That mattered. Jonah stood, offered his hand. Clara took it, and he pulled her to her feet. "Let's get dry," he said. Inside, they changed quickly. Clara in the bedroom, Jonah behind a screen in the main room. When they emerged, both wrapped in blankets, the house felt smaller, more intimate. Clara built up the fire while Jonah made coffee, and they sat at the table watching the storm rage outside. "Does it always rain like this?" Clara asked. "When it rains at all?" Jonah wrapped his hands around his cup. "Could be the drought's breaking, could be just a tease. Desert doesn't make promises." "Nothing does," Clara said quietly. Jonah glanced at her. "You sound like you've learned that the hard way." Clara sipped her coffee, weighing how much to say. "We agreed not to ask about pasts." "We did. But if you want to tell me something, I'll listen." It was the gentlest invitation she'd received in years. Clara set her cup down, watching steam rise and dissipate. "I came from Missouri," she said finally. "St. Louis. I worked as a bookkeeper for a shipping company. Good position, decent pay. I had a life there. What changed? Clara's jaw tightened. Someone decided I owed him something I didn't. Someone with money and influence and the kind of arrogance that comes from never being told no. Jonah went very still. He hurt you? He tried. Clara met his eyes. I left before he could succeed. But men like that don't accept leaving. They view it as theft, like you've stolen something that belongs to them. Nothing belongs to him. You're a person, not property. Tell that to the law. Tell that to society. Clara's voice was bitter. A woman alone with no family, no husband. She's either a charity case or fair game. I was tired of being hunted, so I found your letter, and I came here. Does he know where you are? I hope not. But Clara's hands trembled slightly as she said it. I was careful. I used different names, different routes, but careful doesn't always mean safe. Jonah was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain continued, relentless and cleansing. You're safe here, he said finally. Long as I'm breathing, you're safe here. Clara felt something crack open in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of trust. Real trust, earned through shared work and honest words, and a man who'd just promised her safety without demanding anything in return. Thank you, she whispered. Jonah nodded once, then stood and moved to the window. Storm's easing. I need to check the damage. I'll help. They spent the rest of the afternoon surveying the ranch. The flood had been brutal but brief. Channels were washed out, fences damaged, half the garden lost. But the cattle were safe, the house intact, and the well was fuller than it had been in months. They worked until dark, repairing what could be fixed immediately, making lists of what would need attention in the days ahead. By the time they returned to the house, both were exhausted, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from building something together. That night, Clara fell asleep to the sound of gentle rain, softer now, soaking into grateful earth. For the first time since leaving Missouri, she felt something approaching peace. She didn't know that on the mesa above, sheltered under an overhang of rock, Silas Carrington had watched the entire day unfold through a spyglass. Didn't know he'd seen her fight through the flood to save a worthless animal, seen the way she laughed with the half-breed rancher, seen the way she looked at him like he mattered. Silas lowered the spyglass, his jaw tight with fury. Clara had always been too independent, too convinced of her own worth. He'd been patient with her in St. Louis, offering her opportunities to understand her place. When she'd run, he'd assumed she'd come crawling back once she realized the world wasn't kind to women without protection. But she hadn't come back. She'd found this place, this man, this new life. And that was unacceptable. Silas had papers in his saddlebag, documents that would prove Clara had come to Arizona under false pretenses, that she was legally bound to honor a debt her dead father had left behind, a debt Silas had purchased specifically to own her. The papers weren't entirely legal, but they looked official enough. And in a territory court, with the right judge and the right incentives, they'd be sufficient. He'd give her one more day, let her think she was safe. Then he'd ride down, present his claim, and watch her realize that running had been pointless. She belonged to him. The law said so. And if the half-breed tried to interfere, well, accidents happened in the desert all the time. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the air scrubbed clean by the storm. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Jonah was already up, cooking breakfast in the main room. She dressed and emerged to find him setting plates on the table, moving with the easy competence of a man comfortable in his own space. "Morning," he said. "Figured after yesterday we earned a real breakfast." "Smells good." Clara took her seat, accepting the plate he offered. Eggs, bacon, and bread toasted over the stove, simple but prepared with care. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that had become natural between them. When they finished, Jonah refilled their coffee and sat back down. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you told me yesterday." Clara tensed slightly. "You don't owe me details," Jonah continued, "but if there's a chance this man might come looking, I need to know what we're dealing with, not to judge, to prepare." Clara studied him across the table. His face was open, honest, without the calculation or condescension she'd learned to expect from men asking about her business. "His name is Silas Carrington," she said quietly. "He owns half the shipping warehouses in St. Louis. Banks, property, politicians. He's connected to all of it. And he thinks he owns you because my father owed him money. A lot of money. When my father died, Silas bought the debt from the original lenders and claimed it transferred to me. Clara's hands clenched around her cup. He offered to forgive it if I married him. When I refused, he started making my life impossible, had me dismissed from my position, spread rumors, made it clear he could destroy any future I tried to build. So you ran. So I ran. Clara met Jonah's eyes. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed either. Staying would have meant becoming his property in everything but name. Jonah nodded slowly. If he comes here, he won't find you alone. He's rich, Jonah. He can afford lawyers, Bible judges, hired guns if it comes to that. This is a territory, not a state. The law's flexible for men with money. Maybe. But this is my land, and you're under my protection now. Jonah's voice was steady, absolutely certain. He wants to make a legal claim, we'll fight it legal. He wants to make it something else. We'll handle that too. Clara wanted to argue, to explain that Jonah didn't understand the kind of power Silas wielded, but looking at the man across from her, scarred, weathered, harder than the desert around them, she realized he understood perfectly. He just didn't care. Why? She asked softly. Why risk all this for someone you barely know? Jonah was quiet for a moment, turning his cup between calloused hands. 3 years ago, I buried my wife and daughter on that hill behind the house, he said finally. Lost them to disease I couldn't fight, couldn't stop. Spent 3 years thinking I was done with trying to protect anyone, done with caring enough to hurt when it went wrong. He looked up, meeting Clara's gaze directly. Then you showed up, and I realized I'm not done. Not if there's still someone worth standing up for. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. I don't need rescuing. I know. That's why I'm not offering rescue. I'm offering partnership. We stand together, we're stronger. That's all. That's everything, Clara whispered. They sat in the quiet morning light, two damaged people finding strength in unexpected places, neither quite willing to name what was growing between them, but both feeling its weight. Then horses sounded outside. Jonah was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. Clara joined him, peering out to see 3 riders approaching, 2 rough-looking men flanking a third figure in an expensive suit and a spotless Stetson. Silas Carrington had arrived. Stay inside, Jonah said quietly. No, Clara's voice was firm. I'm done hiding. She walked to the door and stepped out onto the porch before Jonah could stop her. He followed, positioning himself slightly in front, his hand resting casually near the rifle propped by the door. The riders approached slowly, deliberately. Silas dismounted with practiced grace, removing his hat and offering a smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. Miss Wren, he said smoothly, what a relief to find you safe. I've been so worried. Clara's voice was ice. Mr. Carrington, you're a long way from Missouri. Indeed, but when one's property goes missing, one makes the effort to reclaim it. He glanced at Jonah dismissively. I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Silas Carrington of the St. Louis Carringtons, and you are? The man who owns this land, Jonah said flatly, which you're currently trespassing on. Silas's smile hardened. I apologize for any inconvenience. I've simply come to collect Miss Wren and settle a legal matter. Once our business is concluded, we'll be on our way. I'm not going anywhere with you, Clara said. I'm afraid that's not your decision to make. Silas reached into his jacket, producing a folded document. I have here a legally binding contract stating that Clara Wren is indebted to me in the amount of $12,000 inherited from her late father. The contract stipulates that in lieu of cash payment, Miss Wren agreed to enter into marriage to settle the obligation. I never agreed to anything, Clara snapped. And you know it. Your signature is on the document. A signature you forged. Silas's expression shifted, the veneer of civility cracking. Miss Wren, you're hysterical. Understandable given your recent ordeal, but the law is clear and I have every intention of seeing it enforced. Then enforce it through proper channels, Jonah said. Take it to a judge. Until then, she's staying here. One of Silas's hired men shifted in his saddle, hand moving toward his gun. Jonah didn't flinch, but his body language changed, became looser, more dangerous, the stance of a man who'd fought before and wasn't afraid to do it again. Silas noticed. His eyes narrowed, reassessing. "You're harboring my legal property," he said coldly. "That makes you complicit in theft. She's not property, and she's not leaving." "Then you're a fool." Silas replaced his hat, the gesture sharp with controlled fury. "I'll be filing a claim with the territorial court in Tombstone. When the judge rules in my favor, and he will, I'll return with legal authority. And if you continue to interfere, I'll see you arrested for obstruction and thrown in whatever hole they use for jail in this godforsaken wasteland." He remounted his horse, his companions following suit. "3 days, Miss Wren," Silas called as he turned his horse. 3 days to come to your senses. After that, I'll let the law drag you back where you belong." They rode off, dust rising behind them. Clara and Jonah stood on the porch watching until they disappeared beyond the mesa. Then Clara's legs gave out. Jonah caught her before she hit the boards, easing her down to sit on the porch step. She was shaking, breath coming in ragged gasps, the adrenaline draining out and leaving her hollow. "He found me," she whispered. "I was so careful, and he still found me." "Hey," Jonah crouched beside her, his voice steady. "Look at me." Clara forced her eyes to meet his. "We knew this was possible," Jonah said. "Now we know it's real, so we deal with it." "You heard him. He has papers, judges, money. What do we have?" "Truth, and we're not alone." "Jonah, tomorrow we go to Tombstone. We find a lawyer, we get ahead of this, and we fight." His hand closed over hers, warm and solid. "Together, like we've been doing." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that right would win over money, that truth mattered more than forged documents. But she'd lived in the world too long to have much faith in justice. Still, looking at Jonah's face, scarred, weathered, absolutely certain, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. "Together," she echoed. Jonah helped her to her feet, and they went inside to plan their next move. Neither noticed the figure watching from the hills, one of Silas's men stationed to observe and report. The battle for Clara's freedom had only just begun. They rode into Tombstone at dawn, the town still mostly sleeping except for the early risers sweeping boardwalks and the saloons emptying their late-night stragglers into the gray morning light. Clara sat beside Jonah on the wagon seat, her spine straight despite the exhaustion that had kept her awake most of the night. She'd chosen her best dress, the dove-gray wool she'd worn on the train, and pinned her hair with deliberate care. If she was going to fight, she'd do it looking like someone who deserved to be heard. Jonah had cleaned up too, trading his work clothes for a pressed shirt and vest, though he'd refused to wear a tie. His hat was brushed, his boots polished to a dull shine. He looked exactly like what he was, a rancher who'd made an effort, a man who took this seriously. They'd talked late into the previous night, mapping strategy with the careful attention Jonah usually reserved for planning irrigation or predicting weather. Clara had laid out everything she knew about Silas's methods, his connections, the kind of legal manipulation he excelled at. Jonah had listened without interrupting, his face growing harder with each detail. "We need a lawyer," he'd said finally. "Someone who can't be bought." "Does that exist here?" "Maybe. There's a man named Garrett Webb, used to practice in California before he moved to the territory. He's not popular with the mine owners because he takes cases for workers. That means he's either stubborn or stupid." "Or honest," Clara had offered. "That too." Now they were pulling up in front of a modest office on 4th Street, a painted sign reading Garrett Webb, Attorney at Law, swinging gently in the morning breeze. The building was weathered but maintained, the windows clean, the door solid. Jonah helped Clara down from the wagon, and together they climbed the steps. He knocked twice, firm and clear. A voice called from inside, "It's unlocked." They entered to find a man in his 50s sitting behind a desk piled with papers and law books, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. Garrett Webb looked up, curiosity sharpening to attention when he saw them. "Mr. Redfeather," he said, standing. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "Mr. Webb," Jonah removed his hat. "This is Clara Wren. We need legal counsel." Webb's eyes moved to Clara, taking in her appearance with the quick assessment of a man used to reading people. Whatever he saw made him gesture to the chairs facing his desk. "Sit. Tell me what's happened." Clara took a breath and began. She told him about Missouri, about her father's death, and the debt she'd never known existed until Silas presented it as leverage. She told him about the forged marriage contract, the harassment, her decision to leave. She told him about answering Jonah's letter, about coming to Arizona hoping distance would mean safety. And now he's here, she finished, with papers he claims are legal and a threat to take this to territorial court. Webb had been taking notes, his expression neutral and professional. Now he set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair. May I see these papers? I don't have them. He didn't leave copies. That's convenient for him. Webb steepled his fingers. Miss Wren, I won't lie to you. If Carrington has documents that appear legitimate, even if they're forged, and if he has the money to hire competent counsel, this will be difficult. Territorial courts favor property rights and contract law. They're not especially sympathetic to women's claims of coercion. So there's nothing we can do? Clara's voice was steady, but Jonah saw her hands clench in her lap. I didn't say that. Webb pushed his spectacles up. I said it will be difficult, not impossible, but we'll need to be strategic. If he files a claim and gets a hearing, we'll need evidence of fraud, witnesses who can testify to your character and circumstances, and ideally, a competing legal argument that nullifies his claim entirely. What kind of argument? Jonah asked. Webb looked between them, his expression thoughtful. The strongest counter to a marriage contract claim is an existing marriage. If Miss Wren is already legally married, Carrington's document becomes void regardless of its authenticity. Clara went very still. Jonah felt the air shift in the room. You're suggesting we marry, Jonah said flatly. I'm suggesting it's the cleanest legal solution. A marriage performed in Arizona territory, properly witnessed and filed, would supersede any claim from Missouri, especially if we can demonstrate that Miss Wren entered the arrangement freely and without coercion. That's asking a lot, Clara said quietly. It is, Webb agreed. And I won't pretend it's fair that you should have to marry to escape being forced into marriage. The irony isn't lost on me. But we're dealing with the law as it exists, not as it should be. Jonah stood, moving to the window. Outside, Tombstone was waking fully, merchants opening shops, horses being hitched, the daily commerce of a town built on silver and optimism. He could see the courthouse from here, a solid building that represented order and justice and all the things that worked better for some people than others. If we do this, he said without turning around, it's real. I won't make a mockery of marriage just to win a legal argument. I understand, Webb said, and for what it's worth, Mr. Redfeather, I believe your integrity is part of what makes this approach viable. A judge will be more inclined to accept the legitimacy of your marriage if it's clear you're not simply manufacturing a technicality. Clara stood as well, moving to stand beside Jonah at the window. She didn't touch him, but her presence was steady and warm. What do you want to do? She asked softly. Jonah turned to look at her. In the morning light, her face was composed, but her eyes held questions. Not fear exactly, but a kind of careful hope, like she was afraid to want something too much. I want to fight, Jonah said, however we need to. Even if it means making this real instead of convenient. He held her gaze. I told you before, I won't make you property. Marriage isn't ownership, it's partnership. If we do this, we do it as equals or not at all. Clara's eyes glistened, but her voice stayed firm. Then we do it. Webb cleared his throat gently. I'll need to file the marriage license with the county clerk. We'll need witnesses. 2 people who can testify they observed the ceremony and that both parties entered it willingly. I know people, Jonah said. Marshal Tate and his wife. They're fair. Good. And we'll need someone to perform the ceremony. A minister or a justice of the peace. Minister Callahan, Clara said. I met him at the Mercantile last week. He seemed kind. Webb made notes. I'll draw up the paperwork today. If you can arrange the ceremony and witnesses for tomorrow morning, we can have the license filed by noon. That gives us a legal foundation before Carrington makes his move. He said 3 days, Clara reminded him. Then we're working on his timeline. Not ideal, but manageable. Webb stood, extending his hand to Jonah, then to Clara. I'll do everything I can to protect your rights, Miss Wren. Both of you. What do we owe you? Jonah asked. Let's win first. We'll settle accounts after. They left the office with a plan and a deadline. The sun was fully up now, Tombstone humming with activity. Clara felt exposed walking down the street, half expecting Silas to appear around every corner, but Jonah's presence beside her was grounding. "We should talk to Marshal Tate," Jonah said. They found him at the jailhouse, a weathered building on Fremont Street. Robert Tate was a man in his late 40s, gray-haired and hard-eyed, with the kind of calm authority that came from years of keeping order in a town that didn't always want it. He looked up from his desk when they entered, recognition flickering across his face. "Redfeather. Been a while." "Marshal." Jonah removed his hat. "This is Clara Wren, my fiancée." If Tate was surprised, he didn't show it. He stood, offering Clara a respectful nod. "Ma'am, what brings you in?" Jonah explained, giving Tate the abbreviated version, Clara's situation, Carrington's threat, the legal strategy they were pursuing. Tate listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively more disgusted. "Man like that," he said when Jonah finished, "thinks he can buy anything, including people." "Can you help us?" Clara asked. Tate considered. "You're asking me to witness a marriage and testify it was legitimate if this goes to court?" "Yes, sir." "And you're both entering this freely? No coercion on either side?" Clara met his eyes directly. "I'm choosing this. Mr. Redfeather has been nothing but honorable." Tate looked at Jonah. "You understand what you're taking on? Man with Carrington's resources won't give up easy." "I understand." "All right then." Tate pulled out a pocket watch, checked the time. "My wife Ellen will want to be there. She's got a soft spot for women standing up to powerful men." "When and where?" "Tomorrow morning, Minister Callahan's church, if he'll have us." "He will. Callahan's good people." Tate extended his hand to Jonah, then to Clara. "You've got our support. And if Carrington tries anything outside the law, he'll answer to me." The relief Clara felt was almost physical. "Thank you, Marshal." They spent the rest of the day making arrangements. Minister Callahan agreed immediately, his weathered face creasing with warmth when they explained the situation. He was an old circuit preacher who'd settled in Tombstone after his traveling days ended, and he had no patience for men who used law and money to terrorize women. "I'll marry you proper," he said firmly, "and I'll testify to it if needed. You come at 9 tomorrow morning, we'll make it official." They bought simple rings at the mercantile, plain gold bands that fit well enough. The shopkeeper, a woman named Mrs. Hendricks, who'd always been coolly polite to Jonah, surprised them both by refusing payment. "My gift," she said, wrapping the rings in brown paper. "Any woman brave enough to stand up to men like Carrington deserves support." Word was spreading. Clara could feel it in the way people looked at them as they walked through town. Curiosity? Yes, but also something like respect. By the time they climbed back into the wagon for the ride home, the sun was setting and Clara felt wrung out from emotion and effort. They were halfway back to the ranch when Jonah finally spoke. "You don't have to do this." Clara looked at him sharply. "We already decided. I know what we decided in Webb's office. I'm saying now, away from lawyers and witnesses, that you still have a choice. If you want to run instead, really run. California, Oregon, somewhere he can't follow. I'll help you. I'll give you money, supplies, whatever you need." "Why would you do that?" "Because you deserve to be free. And if marrying me feels like another kind of trap, I won't force it." Clara was quiet for a long moment, watching the desert roll past in shades of amber and shadow. The mesas were dark silhouettes against the fading sky, and somewhere a coyote called, lonely and wild. "I've been running for months," she said finally. "I'm tired of it, and this doesn't feel like a trap." "What does it feel like?" Clara turned to look at him fully. "Like choosing instead of being chosen, like partnership instead of possession." She paused. "Like maybe the first honest thing I've done in a year." Jonah's hands tightened on the reins, but his voice stayed steady. "Then we'll do it right. Not just for the law, for us." "For us," Clara agreed. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was the comfortable kind, the kind that came from understanding. When they reached the ranch, Jonah helped Clara down and they stood together in the doorway, looking at the house that would soon legally belong to both of them. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," Jonah said. "Give you space to think." "You don't have to "I do." He met her eyes. "Tomorrow changes things. Tonight, you should have quiet. Clara nodded, grateful for the consideration. She watched Jonah walk toward the barn, his silhouette dark against the star-filled sky, and felt something settle in her chest. Not love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But trust. Real, hard-won trust. She went inside, lit the lamp, and sat at the table. Tomorrow she would marry a man she'd known less than 2 weeks. Tomorrow she would tie her life to his in the eyes of the law and whatever higher power Minister Callahan invoked. Tomorrow she would become Clara Redfeather. The name felt strange and right all at once. Clara pulled out paper and pencil, intending to write down her thoughts, to process the enormity of what was coming. But instead she found herself writing a letter to the woman she'd been in Missouri, the one who'd worked quietly and hoped invisibility would keep her safe. She wrote about the ranch, about the desert, about a man who'd promised partnership instead of rescue. She wrote about choosing her own path even when the options were all hard. And when she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the stove, watching it burn to ash. That woman was gone. Tomorrow, someone new would take her place. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cool, the sky that particular shade of blue that only happened in the desert. Clara dressed in her best clothes, the dove-gray dress, freshly pressed, with a white collar she'd sewn on the night before. She pinned her hair carefully, wove in a few wildflowers Jonah had picked at dawn, and left on the porch in a jar. Jonah wore his cleanest shirt and vest, his hair still damp from washing, his face freshly shaved. He looked nervous, which made Clara feel oddly better about her own churning stomach. They rode to Tombstone in near silence, both too aware of what the day meant to fill it with small talk. But Jonah's hand found hers on the wagon seat, and Clara held on tight. The church was small, whitewashed wood with a simple cross above the door. Minister Callahan was waiting on the steps, his wife beside him, a tiny woman with silver hair and fierce eyes. Marshal Tate and his wife Ellen arrived moments later, Ellen carrying a small bouquet of desert flowers tied with ribbon. "Every bride should have flowers," Ellen said firmly, pressing them into Clara's hands. They gathered inside the church, sunlight streaming through plain glass windows to paint patterns on the worn floorboards. Minister Callahan stood at the front, his Bible open, his expression solemn and kind. "We're here," he said in his rumbling voice, "to join Jonah Redfeather and Clara Wren in marriage. This is a sacred commitment, not entered into lightly, but with full knowledge of its meaning and responsibilities." He looked at Clara. "Miss Wren, do you come here of your own free will, without coercion or force?" "I do," Clara said clearly. "Mr. Redfeather, same question." "Yes, sir. My own free will." Callahan nodded. "Then let's proceed." The ceremony was simple, the old words carrying weight despite their familiarity. Callahan spoke about partnership, about weathering storms together, about the kind of strength that came from two people choosing to stand side by side against whatever came, an equal. To listen when you speak, to an equal. To listen when you speak, to share the work and the burdens, to protect your freedom as fiercely as my own. I promise to be honest, even when it's hard. And I promise that you will always have a choice, always have a voice in this partnership. Claire's throat was tight, but her voice stayed steady. I promise to pull my weight, to stand beside you in work and in trouble. I promise to be honest about who I am and what I need. I promise to respect your grief and your past, and to build a future that honors both of us. And I promise that you will never be alone in this fight, whatever form it takes. Callahan smiled. The rings? Jonah produced the simple gold bands, and they exchanged them with hands that trembled slightly. The metal was warm from Jonah's pocket, solid and real. "By the authority vested in me," Callahan said, "and before these witnesses, I pronounce you husband and wife. What's joined here today, let no man," his eyes hardened, "no matter his wealth or influence, put asunder. You may kiss your bride." Jonah hesitated, waiting for Clara's permission. She nodded slightly, and he leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips. Brief, chaste, but sincere. It was their first kiss, and it tasted like coffee and promise, and the beginning of something neither could quite name. The witnesses applauded. Ellen hugged Clara fiercely, whispering, "You're braver than you know." Marshal Tate shook Jonah's hand with genuine warmth, and Minister Callahan signed the marriage certificate with a flourish, before handing it to Jonah. "File this today," he said. "Don't wait." They went directly to the courthouse, where the county clerk, a bored-looking man named Stevens, processed the paperwork with bureaucratic efficiency. By noon, the marriage was officially recorded in the territorial register. Clara Redfeather. It was real now. They were walking back to the wagon when a voice called out, "How touching!" Silas Carrington stood across the street, flanked by his 2 hired men and a third figure, a sharp-dressed man with a leather portfolio who could only be a lawyer. Silas's expression was cold fury barely contained beneath a veneer of civility. "Married," he said, crossing toward them. "How convenient, and how utterly transparent." "It's legal," Jonah said flatly, "and it's done." "Oh, I don't doubt it's legal." Silas's smile was a blade. "But it changes nothing. Clara still owes me $12,000, a debt that doesn't disappear because she found some frontier savage to play house with." Jonah's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, Clara stepped forward. "I owe you nothing," she said clearly. "That debt was my father's, not mine, and your forged contract isn't worth the paper it's printed on." "Forged?" Silas's voice dripped false shock. "Strong words, my dear. I have your signature dated and witnessed." "You have a forgery." "Then we'll let a judge decide." Silas nodded to his lawyer. "Mr. Brennan has already filed a claim with the territorial court. We have a hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. I suggest you attend, though I suspect the outcome is foregone." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Jonah with contempt. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts, Redfeather. When the court rules in my favor, I'll be taking my property back. And if you interfere, I'll see you hanged for kidnapping." Silas and his entourage walked away, leaving Clara and Jonah standing in the dusty street. Around them, townsfolk had stopped to watch, the gossip already spreading like wildfire. Clara felt the weight of it. The scrutiny, the judgment, the way some faces showed sympathy while others showed nothing but curiosity about how this drama would unfold. "Come on," Jonah said quietly, taking her hand. "Let's go home." They collected the wagon and rode out of town in silence. Clara stared at the ring on her finger, simple gold, catching light as her hands twisted in her lap. She was married, legally bound to a man she barely knew, gambling everything on the hope that truth and law would align for once. "We'll go see Webb," Jonah said as they neared the ranch. "Tell him about the hearing. Figure out our strategy." "Jonah?" Claire's voice was small. "What if we lose?" "Then we fight harder." "He said kidnapping. He could have you arrested." "Let him try." Jonah's voice was granite. "I meant what I said in those vows, Clara. You're not alone in this. Whatever comes, we face it together." Clara leaned against his shoulder, letting herself draw strength from his solid presence. The desert stretched around them, vast and unforgiving, but somehow beautiful in its honesty. This land didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It didn't promise easy. It just offered truth. Hard, relentless, real. And maybe that was enough. They spent the evening preparing for the hearing, with Webb joining them at the ranch to review strategy. The lawyer was methodical, asking Clara detailed questions about the supposed contract, about her father's business dealings, about every interaction she'd had with Silas. "His weakness," Webb said finally, "is that he's overconfident. Men like Carrington are used to winning because they assume their money makes them untouchable. But territorial judges, especially Judge Harrison, who'll hear this case, don't appreciate being manipulated. If we can demonstrate that Carrington is trying to use the court to enforce fraud, Harrison will take it personally." "How do we prove fraud?" Clara asked. "We start by challenging the signature. You say it's forged. Can you demonstrate that?" Clara thought about it. "My handwriting is distinctive. I cross my T's with a specific slant, and I never close my A's completely at the top. If the signature doesn't match those details, it would be obvious to anyone paying attention." "Good. We'll request the document be entered into evidence and examined. What else?" They worked late into the night, building arguments, anticipating counterarguments, preparing Clara for the possibility of hostile questioning. By the time Webb left, Clara was exhausted but grimly determined. Jonah walked the lawyer to his horse, speaking quietly. "If this goes wrong, if they try to take her, it won't come to that," Webb said firmly. "Trust the law, Redfeather. For once, it might actually work the way it's supposed to. After Webb rode off, Jonah returned to find Clara standing on the porch, staring at the stars. "You should sleep," he said gently. "Can't." Clara wrapped her arms around herself. "Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. Hear his voice telling me I'm his property." Jonah moved to stand beside her. "You're not. You never were. And tomorrow we prove it." Clara turned to him, and in the starlight her face was pale but fierce. "I need you to promise me something. Anything. If this goes wrong, if somehow he wins and the law sides with him, promise me you won't do anything stupid. Don't fight if it means you'll be killed or imprisoned. I won't have your blood on my conscience." Clara swore. "Promise me, Jonah." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd walked into his life less than 2 weeks ago and changed everything. This woman who was now his wife, legally and before witnesses, bound to him in a way he hadn't expected to matter, but somehow did. "I promise," he said quietly, "that I will do everything in my power to keep us both safe and free. But I won't promise to abandon you if things get hard. That's not who I am." Clara's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back. "That's why I married you." Jonah pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in their first real embrace. Clara leaned into him, letting herself be held, drawing comfort from his strength and warmth. They stood like that for a long time, two people facing the dark together, neither knowing what tomorrow would bring, but both refusing to face it alone. When they finally went inside, Jonah made up the couch while Clara took the bedroom, but neither slept much. They lay in the dark, in separate spaces, both staring at ceilings and wondering if marriage and truth would be enough armor against money and malice. Morning came too soon, pale light creeping through windows, bringing with it the weight of everything they had to face. Clara dressed carefully again, pinning her hair tight, wearing the gray dress that had become her armor. Jonah wore his best clothes, his expression set in hard lines. They rode to Tombstone in silence, the wagon wheels kicking up dust, the sun climbing steadily toward what felt like judgment. The courthouse was already filling when they arrived, townspeople drawn by gossip, businessmen with interests in seeing how the law treated property disputes, and sitting in the front row like a conquering general, Silas Carrington with his lawyer and his hired men. Clara held her head high as she walked down the aisle on Jonah's arm, refusing to flinch under Silas's cold stare. Webb was waiting at the defendant's table, papers organized, his face calm and professional. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Clara took a breath. "Yes." Judge Harrison entered, a gray-haired man in his 60s with the weathered face of someone who'd lived hard before ending up behind a bench. He surveyed the courtroom with sharp eyes, nodded to the clerk, and called the court to order. "Case of Carrington versus Wren," the clerk announced. "Claim of debt enforcement and contract compliance." Silas's lawyer, Brennan, stood smoothly. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of contract law." And the battle began. Brennan was polished and confident, the kind of lawyer who'd won more cases through intimidation than legal brilliance. He laid out Silas's claim with theatrical precision, his voice filling the courtroom as he painted Clara as a debtor, fleeing legitimate obligations. "Your Honor, the facts are simple and indisputable. Miss Wren's father, Thomas Wren, borrowed $12,000 from various creditors to finance a shipping venture that ultimately failed. Upon his death in April of this year, those debts transferred to his sole surviving heir, the defendant. My client, Mr. Carrington, purchased these debts in good faith and offered Miss Wren extraordinarily generous terms, forgiveness of the entire sum, in exchange for an honorable marriage contract." Brennan produced a document with a flourish, holding it up for the court to see. "This contract, signed by Miss Wren herself and properly witnessed, constitutes a legally binding agreement. Rather than honor her commitment, Miss Wren fled Missouri, came to this territory under false pretenses, and entered into a marriage clearly designed to evade her lawful obligations. We ask this court to void that marriage as fraudulent, enforce the original contract, and order Miss Wren to fulfill the terms she agreed to." He sat down with the satisfied air of a man who'd just delivered a killing blow. Judge Harrison looked at the document without reaching for it. "Mr. Webb, your response?" Webb stood slowly, and Clara noticed the deliberate way he moved, measured, unhurried, refusing to match Brennan's theatrical energy. When he spoke, his voice was calm and clear. Your Honor, this case is not about debt. It's about a powerful man attempting to use this court to enforce ownership of a human being, the so-called contract mister. Brennan has presented is a forgery, the signature fraudulent, and the entire premise a fabrication designed to give legal cover to what amounts to attempted abduction and coercion. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Silas's expression darkened, but he kept his composure. Those are serious allegations, Mr. Webb, Harrison said. Yes, sir, they are. And we can prove every one of them. Webb turned to Clara. Mrs. Redfeather, would you please stand? Clara rose, her legs steadier than she'd expected. Every eye in the courtroom was on her, but she kept her focus on the judge. Mrs. Redfeather, Webb said, did you sign the document Mr. Brennan has presented to this court? No, sir, I did not. Have you ever agreed, verbally or in writing, to marry Silas Carrington? Never. Did your father leave you any debts that you were aware of? Clara hesitated. Truth mattered here. My father had business troubles before he died, but he told me explicitly that any debts he carried would not transfer to me. He'd arranged it with his creditors. The debts would die with him in exchange for liquidating his assets. And did you participate in that liquidation? Yes. I sold his business equipment, settled his office lease, and turned over everything of value to the creditors he'd named. They confirmed the debts were satisfied. Webb nodded. Your Honor, we request the court examine the signature on Mr. Brennan's document and compare it to Mrs. Redfeather's actual handwriting. We have samples here, her marriage license, filed yesterday with this very courthouse, and several letters she wrote during her employment in Missouri, which we obtained through correspondence with her former employer. He handed a folder to the clerk, who passed it to Harrison. The judge put on his spectacles and studied the documents carefully, his expression giving nothing away. Brennan stood. Your Honor, handwriting analysis is hardly a precise science. Sit down, Mr. Brennan. Harrison's voice was sharp. I'll decide what's relevant. The courtroom went silent. Harrison spent several minutes comparing the signature on the contract to Clara's verified samples, his weathered finger tracing letters, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he looked up. Mr. Brennan, I've reviewed enough contested documents in my career to recognize forgery when I see it. The signature on your contract doesn't match any of the verified samples. The T's are crossed differently, the A's are fully closed, and the slant is wrong. This is amateur work at best. Brennan's confidence cracked. Your Honor, with respect, I'm not finished. Harrison's voice carried the weight of 20 years on the bench. Even if the signature were genuine, which it clearly is not, this contract would be unconscionable on its face. Debt does not transfer to heirs except through probate, and there's no evidence this debt was ever properly probated. More importantly, marriage contracts require free consent from both parties. A contract that offers debt forgiveness in exchange for marriage is coercive by definition and would be void under basic principles of contract law. He fixed Silas with a hard stare. Mr. Carrington, did you come to my territory thinking we're so backward we wouldn't recognize fraud when it's presented to us? Silas stood, his composure finally slipping. Your Honor, I assure you, you'll sit down and be silent, or I'll hold you in contempt. Harrison turned back to Brennan. Does your client have any legitimate documentation showing that these debts were legally transferred to Miss Wren through proper probate proceedings? Brennan shuffled papers, stalling. The original creditors were willing to testify. I asked about documentation, counselor, legal documentation, probate records, court orders. Do you have any? The records from Missouri are still being compiled. Then you have nothing. Harrison removed his spectacles. Mr. Webb, I assume you have something to add. Webb stood again. Yes, Your Honor. We wish to present evidence that Mrs. Redfeather's marriage to Mr. Jonah Redfeather is legitimate and was entered into freely, without coercion. We have witnesses present who can testify to the circumstances. Call your first witness. The territory calls Marshal Robert Tate. Tate took the stand with the solid authority of a man who'd testified in court many times. He was sworn in, and Webb approached. Marshal Tate, you witnessed the marriage of Jonah Redfeather and Clara Wren yesterday morning. Can you describe the circumstances? Yes, sir. They came to Minister Callahan's church at 9 o'clock. Both parties appeared of sound mind and stated clearly they were entering the marriage of their own free will. The ceremony was conducted properly, and I witnessed them exchange vows and rings. There was no coercion, no duress, no indication of anything improper. Did either party appear reluctant or uncertain? No, sir. They were nervous, like most people getting married, but they were certain about what they were doing. Thank you, Marshal. Webb turned to Brennan. Your witness. Brennan approached Tate with barely concealed hostility. Marshal, how long have you known Mr. Redfeather? About 10 years. And would you say you're friendly with him? I'd say we're respectful. He keeps to himself mostly, but he's never caused trouble. So you'd be inclined to help him if he asked? Tate's eyes narrowed. I'd be inclined to do my job, which is uphold the law and protect citizens from those who'd abuse them. But you admit you have a relationship with the defendant. The defendant is Mrs. Redfeather now, Tate interrupted. And yes, I witnessed her marriage because I was asked to and because I believed it was legitimate. If you're suggesting I'd lie under oath, Counselor, you're mistaken. Brennan retreated, knowing he'd lost that exchange. Harrison looked mildly amused. Next witness, Mr. Webb? Minister Callahan, Your Honor. The old preacher took the stand with quiet dignity. Webb kept his questions simple. When did you meet the couple? What did you observe? Did anything seem improper or forced? Callahan's answers were steady and clear. He'd married hundreds of couples in his life, he said, and he knew the difference between two people choosing each other and two people being pushed together. The Redfeathers were the former. Brennan tried to shake him, suggesting Callahan had been paid or persuaded, but the minister's reputation was too solid. The courtroom clearly respected him, and every question Brennan asked only made his case look weaker. The territory calls Clara Redfeather, Webb said. Clara's heart hammered as she approached the witness stand. She was sworn in, her hand on the Bible surprisingly steady, and took her seat facing the packed courtroom. Silas sat in the front row, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Webb approached gently. Mrs. Redfeather, please tell the court how you came to be in Arizona Territory. Clara took a breath and began. She told her story simply, without embellishment, her father's death, the sudden appearance of Silas claiming debts she'd never heard of, his proposal that felt more like threat than offer. She described the harassment, the job she lost, the sense of being hunted. He made it clear, Clara said, that he could make my life impossible if I didn't comply. When other women refused him in the past, he ruined them. One lost her teaching position and couldn't find work anywhere in Missouri. Another was spread rumors about until her reputation was destroyed. I knew if I stayed, he'd crush me one way or another. So you came to Arizona. I answered a matrimonial advertisement. Mr. Redfeather was honest about what he needed, a partner to help run his ranch. He didn't promise romance or easy living. He promised fair treatment and hard work. That was more honesty than I'd gotten from anyone in months. And when you arrived, what did you find? Exactly what he promised. A man who kept his word, treated me with respect, and never once made me feel like property. Webb let that statement hang in the air before continuing. When Mr. Carrington appeared at the ranch, what did he say to you? He said I was his property, that the law would give me back to him, that Mr. Redfeather would be arrested if he tried to stop it. And how did that make you feel? Terrified and furious. Clara's voice strengthened. I've spent my whole life being told what I could and couldn't do, where I could and couldn't go, who I could and couldn't be, all because I was born female. I came to Arizona to escape that, to build something on my own terms. Mr. Carrington showing up felt like the whole world was determined to put me back in a cage. Is that why you married Mr. Redfeather? To escape? Clara looked directly at Jonah, who sat at the defendant's table watching her with steady dark eyes. I married him because we're partners, because he respects me, because I'd rather build a life with someone who sees me as an equal than spend one more day being owned by someone who sees me as an acquisition. Webb nodded, satisfied. Your witness, Mr. Brennan. Brennan approached like a predator who'd spotted weakness. Mrs. Redfeather, you claim you never signed my client's contract. Yet you admit you were employed as a bookkeeper. Surely you can't deny your own handwriting. I'm not denying my handwriting. I'm denying I ever wrote that signature. Convenient. Brennan's smile was nasty. You also claim my client harassed you, yet you never filed any formal complaints, never sought legal protection. Why is that? Because women who accuse powerful men of harassment are rarely believed. And when they are believed, they're punished for speaking up. Or perhaps because no harassment occurred and you're fabricating this entire story to justify your breach of contract. Webb stood. Objection. Counsel is testifying. Sustained. Harrison looked at Brennan. Ask questions, counselor. Don't make speeches. Brennan pivoted. Mrs. Redfeather, you married Mr. Redfeather less than 2 weeks after arriving in Arizona. Isn't it true you barely knew him? We knew each other well enough to understand what we were promising. You expect this court to believe a marriage performed in obvious haste, the day before this hearing, is anything other than a legal maneuver? Clara met his eyes without flinching. I expect this court to recognize that two adults entering a marriage freely and honestly have every right to do so, regardless of timing, and I expect this court to reject the attempt of a man who forged documents and crossed 1,000 miles to enforce ownership of someone who was never his. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Harrison banged his gavel once, and silence fell. Brennan tried several more angles, questioning Clara's motives, suggesting she'd deceived Jonah, implying the marriage was a fraud. But Clara held firm, her answers steady, her composure unshaken. By the time Brennan sat down, he looked frustrated and outmaneuvered. Redirect Mr. Webb? Harrison asked. Just one question, Your Honor. Webb approached Clara again. Mrs. Redfeather, in your own words, why did you marry Jonah Redfeather? Clara looked at Jonah again, and this time she let herself really see him. The scars, the weathered strength, the quiet decency that had drawn her from the first moment. She thought about the way he'd given her space, respected her choices, stood beside her without demanding she shrink herself to fit his expectations. I married him, Clara said quietly, because he's the first man who's ever treated me like I'm worth standing up for, and because I want to build a life with someone who sees me as a person, not a prize to be won or property to be claimed. Whatever else happens, that's the truth. The courtroom was utterly silent. Webb nodded. No further questions. Harrison looked at both legal teams. Closing arguments? Brennan made one last attempt, arguing that the marriage was suspicious in timing and that debts were legal obligations regardless of transfer procedures. But his heart wasn't in it. The forgery had gutted his case, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Webb's closing was brief and devastating. Your Honor, this case is simple. Mr. Carrington forged a document, pursued a woman across state lines, and attempted to use this court to enforce ownership of a human being. He has presented no legitimate evidence of debt, no proof of proper legal transfer, and no credible argument that his so-called contract is anything other than a tool of coercion. Mrs. Redfeather's marriage to Mr. Redfeather is legitimate, properly witnessed, and legally filed. We ask this court to dismiss Mr. Carrington's claim entirely and to consider sanctions against both Mr. Carrington and his counsel for bringing a frivolous and fraudulent case before this bench. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers before him. Then he looked up, his expression carved from stone. I've sat on this bench for 20 years, he said, and I've seen a lot of attempts to abuse the law. This is one of the more brazen examples. Mr. Carrington, your document is forged. Your claim is fraudulent, and your attempt to use my court to enforce ownership of a human being is offensive to every principle of justice. Silas started to speak, but Harrison's glare silenced him. The marriage of Jonah and Clara Redfeather is legitimate and will stand. Mr. Carrington's claim is dismissed with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled. Furthermore, I'm ordering Mr. Carrington to pay court costs and a fine of $1,000 for presenting fraudulent documents to this court. He banged the gavel. This case is closed. Mr. Carrington, if you're still in my territory by nightfall, I'll have Marshal Tate arrest you for criminal fraud. Get out. The courtroom exploded. People were talking, some cheering, others arguing. Clara sat frozen, barely processing what had just happened. Jonah was suddenly beside her, his hand finding hers, squeezing tight. We won, he said quietly. Clara looked up at him, and the weight of it hit her all at once. They'd won. Against money, against power, against a system designed to favor men like Silas, they'd won. She started crying, couldn't help it, and Jonah pulled her close while Webb shook hands with Marshal Tate and Minister Callahan clapped them both on the shoulders. Around them, townspeople who'd watched the proceedings were offering congratulations and misses. Hendricks from the Mercantile was beaming like she'd won the case herself. Across the courtroom, Silas stood rigid with fury, Brennan whispering urgently in his ear. For a moment, Clara thought he might cause a scene, might try one last desperate move. But Marshal Tate was already approaching, hand resting on his gun, and Silas's survival instincts overcame his rage. He turned and walked out without a word, his hired men following, Brennan trailing behind with his ruined case files. The courtroom watched them go, and someone started clapping. Soon the whole room was applauding, and Clara realized they were clapping for her and Jonah. Webb touched Clara's shoulder gently. "You did well in there, both of you." "Thank you," Clara managed, "for everything." "Just doing my job. Though I admit it's satisfying when the law works the way it should." He shook Jonah's hand firmly. "Take care of each other, and if Carrington tries anything else, you let me know immediately." "He won't," Marshal Tate said, joining them. "I'll make sure of it. Man like that, public humiliation hurts worse than any fine. He'll crawl back to Missouri and lick his wounds." "I hope you're right," Claire said. "I'm always right." Tate's weathered face creased in something close to a smile. "You two deserve some peace. Go home. Enjoy it." They left the courthouse in a daze, the Arizona sun bright after the dim interior. Tombstone seemed different somehow, less hostile, more like a place where Clara might actually belong. People nodded to them as they passed, and several women smiled at Clara with genuine warmth. They climbed into the wagon, and Jonah took the reins. But before he clicked the horses into motion, he turned to Clara. "You were incredible in there," he said. "I was terrified." "Didn't show. You stood up to him, spoke truth, and didn't back down. That takes courage." Clara looked at her hands. They were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "I couldn't have done it without you, without all of you. That's what I've been trying to tell you. You're not alone anymore." The ride back to the ranch was quiet but comfortable, both of them processing what had happened, what it meant. The desert stretched around them, vast and indifferent, but somehow Clara didn't find it lonely anymore. The land was harsh, yes, but it was honest, and there was beauty in that honesty, strength in that harshness. They were almost home when they saw the smoke. Black smoke rising from the direction of the ranch, thick and oily against the clean sky. Jonah's whole body went rigid, and he snapped the reins, urging the horses faster. Clara grabbed the wagon seat, her heart in her throat, as they raced toward whatever disaster awaited. The barn was burning. Flames engulfed the structure, eating through dry wood with terrifying speed. The animals, the few cattle, the horses, the goat they'd saved from the flood, were milling in panicked confusion in the far corral, but the barn itself was already lost. Jonah pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down, Clara right behind him. He ran toward the house, checking to make sure it wasn't threatened, while Clara grabbed buckets and started hauling water from the well. It was useless against a fire that size, but she had to try. Other figures emerged from the smoke, 2 men on horseback, watching from a safe distance. Even through the wavering heat, Clara recognized them. Silas's hired guns. One of them tipped his hat mockingly before they both turned and rode off, disappearing into the desert. Jonah saw them too. His face went murderous, but he forced himself to stay focused on the immediate crisis. Together, he and Clara did what they could, wetting down the house to protect it from flying embers, moving the animals farther from danger, salvaging what tools and supplies they could reach before the flames drove them back. By the time the fire burned itself out, the barn was nothing but charred timbers and ash. The structure Jonah had built with his own hands, the space where he'd sheltered and worked and slept while giving Clara the house, gone. They stood in the yard as the sun set, both of them covered in soot and ash, staring at the destruction. The acrid smell of burned wood filled the air, and small flames still flickered in the ruins. Clara felt sick. They'd won in court, but Silas had made sure they'd pay for it anyway. This was his message, that law didn't matter, that he could reach them whenever he wanted, that winning a legal battle didn't mean winning the war. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This is my fault. He did this because of me." "No," Jonah's voice was hard. "He did this because he's a coward who can't accept losing. That's on him, not you. But your barn, everything you worked for, can be rebuilt." Jonah turned to face her, his expression fierce in the fading light. Clara, listen to me. Property can be replaced. Buildings can be reconstructed. What matters is that we're both standing here, alive and free. That's what Carrington tried to take, and that's what he failed to get. Clara wanted to believe him, but looking at the smoking ruins, all she could see was the cost of her freedom. Jonah had lost so much, not just today, but 3 years ago when his family died, and now, again because he'd chosen to stand with her. We should tell Marshal Tate, she said. We will, tomorrow. Tonight, we deal with what's in front of us. They spent the remaining daylight securing the animals, checking for any remaining fire hazards, and salvaging what little they could from the barn's perimeter. When darkness finally forced them to stop, they were exhausted, filthy, and running on fumes of adrenaline and determination. Inside the house, Clara heated water for washing while Jonah checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were secure. The mood was grim, the victory in court feeling hollow against the reality of what Silas's vengeance had cost them. They ate a cold meal, neither having energy to cook, and sat at the table in heavy silence. I'll rebuild, Jonah said finally. It'll take time, and it'll be hard, but I've built before. We'll rebuild, Clara corrected quietly. Partners, remember? Something shifted in Jonah's expression, the grimness easing slightly, replaced by something warmer. Partners, he agreed. They cleaned up in silence, and when it came time to sleep, Jonah moved toward the door, intending to make up a bedroll in the house since the barn was gone. Jonah, Clara's voice stopped him. You don't have to sleep out here. He turned slowly. Clara, I'm not suggesting anything improper, but we're married, legally, in the eyes of everyone who matters. And after today, after everything, I don't want to be alone. Do you? Jonah was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. No, I don't. Then stay. We'll figure out the rest as we go. They prepared for bed in careful silence, maintaining privacy and respect. But when they finally lay down, Jonah on one side of the bed, Clara on the other, a careful distance between them, the simple act of not being alone felt like its own kind of victory. Thank you, Clara whispered into the darkness. For today. For all of this. Thank you for staying, Jonah replied. For choosing this life, for choosing me. Clara reached across the space between them, finding his hand in the dark. Jonah's fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and real. They fell asleep like that, holding hands across the darkness. Two people who'd started as strangers and become partners, who'd fought for their freedom and won despite the cost, who were learning that sometimes the strongest foundations were built not in certainty, but in choosing each other, again and again, through every challenge the desert threw at them. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying away the last of the smoke, leaving the stars sharp and bright above a ranch that had survived fire and drought and the malice of powerful men. Tomorrow, they would rebuild. Tonight, they rested. Morning came with the acrid smell of burned wood still hanging in the air. Clara woke to find Jonah already gone from the bed, though the indent of his body remained in the mattress beside her. She dressed quickly and found him outside, standing in front of the barn's charred remains, coffee cup in hand, studying the destruction with the calculating eye of a man already planning reconstruction. How bad is it? Clara asked, joining him with her own cup. Bad enough. Lost most of the tools, all the stored hay, some tack I can't replace easily. Jonah's voice was matter of fact, but Clara heard the weight beneath it. But the foundation's still solid. Stone doesn't burn. We can build on what's left. How long will it take? Depends on how much help we get. Alone? Months. With help, maybe 6 weeks to get something functional. He glanced at her. First thing is reporting this to Tate. Get it on record that Carrington's men did this. They rode to Tombstone after checking on the animals and securing what needed securing. The morning was cool, promising another scorching afternoon, and the desert was coming alive with the small sounds of creatures greeting the day. Despite everything, Clara found herself noticing the beauty, the way light caught on red rock, the purple shadows in the mesas, the endless sky that made human troubles seem small and temporary. Marshal Tate listened to their report with a jaw so tight Clara could see the muscle jumping. When Jonah finished describing the two riders who'd watched the barn burn, Tate slammed his hand on the desk. "Goddamn coward," he said, then looked at Clara. "Pardon my language, ma'am." I've thought worse, Clara assured him. Problem is proving it. Tate leaned back in his chair. You saw two men on horses. Can you identify them specifically as Carrington's hired guns? I recognize them from when Carrington came to the ranch, Clara said. Same men who flanked him. That'll help, but it's not proof they set the fire. Carrington's smart enough to have cleared out of the territory by now, which means even if we track down his men, they just claim they were riding through and saw smoke like anyone else might. So he gets away with it, Jonas said flatly. Legally? Probably. Tate's expression was grim. But word travels. I'll make sure every lawman between here and Missouri knows Silas Carrington is a vengeful snake who burns property when he doesn't get his way. That kind of reputation sticks. Makes it harder for him to operate, harder to find people willing to work for him, harder to show his face in polite society. That's not justice, Clara said. No, ma'am, it's not. But sometimes it's the best we can do. Tate stood. I'll ride out to your place later, document the damage officially. And I'll ask around, quietly, see if anyone saw those riders heading back toward town or camping nearby. You never know what might shake loose. They left the marshal's office feeling unsatisfied but unsure what else to expect. Justice was a complicated thing in the territory, Clara was learning. Sometimes the law worked exactly as it should, like in the courtroom yesterday. Sometimes it fell short, constrained by practicalities and the limits of what could be proven. As they walked back toward the wagon, a voice called out, Mr. and Mrs. Redfeather? They turned to find a group of people approaching, Minister Callahan and his wife Ellen Tate, Mrs. Hendricks from the Mercantile, and half a dozen others Clara recognized from the courtroom. Callahan stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. We heard about the barn, he said. Word got around fast. News does that here, Jonas said cautiously. We want to help rebuild it. This from a man Clara didn't know, someone weathered and strong-looking, with carpenter's hands. Name's Dutch Morrison. I frame buildings. Got some crew who owe me favors. We could have you a new barn up in 3 weeks if you've got the lumber. Clara stared at him. Why would you do that? Because what you two did yesterday mattered, Ellen Tate said firmly. Standing up to a man like Carrington, winning in court fair and square, that matters. It tells every woman in this territory that maybe the law can work for us too, if we're brave enough to use it. And it tells men like Carrington that they can't just buy whatever they want, including people. Plus, Mrs. Hendricks added with a slight smile, burning a barn in retaliation makes Carrington look exactly like the petty tyrant he is. Makes folks want to help you even more, just to spite him. Jonah looked overwhelmed, an expression Clara had never seen on his normally stoic face. I can't pay. Don't want payment, Dutch interrupted. Want to build something good. You supply the materials, we'll supply the labor. Fair? Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She'd spent so long believing the world was full of people looking to take advantage, to exploit, to claim ownership. She'd forgotten there were also people who simply wanted to help, who saw injustice and chose to stand against it in whatever way they could. That's more than fair, she managed. That's generous beyond measure. Then it's settled. Callahan clapped Jonah on the shoulder. We'll come out Saturday, start clearing the site and laying out the new structure. You make a list of what lumber you need, and we'll see about getting it hauled out. The group dispersed with promises to spread the word and gather supplies. Jonah and Clara stood alone on the street, both of them still processing what had just happened. I didn't expect that, Jonah said quietly. Neither did I. Clara looked at him. You've lived here 10 years. Have people ever offered to help like this before? No. Usually they pretend I don't exist. He paused, thinking. Maybe that's partly my fault. After Sarah and the baby died, I shut everyone out, stopped trying to be part of the community. Maybe they were just following my lead. And now? Now we're not alone anymore. You changed that. Changed. By being willing to stand up, to speak truth, to let people see that fighting back is possible, you changed everything. Clara shook her head. We changed it, together. They spent the rest of the week preparing for the barn raising. Jonah made lists of materials and put in orders with the lumber yard. Clara organized the house to accommodate the work crew, baking bread and preparing food for the people who'd be giving up their Saturday. Marshal Tate came out as promised, documented the fire damage, and confirmed he'd found witnesses who'd seen two unfamiliar riders heading south out of Tombstone the evening of the fire. Not proof positive, but enough to add weight to their account. Webb stopped by midweek to check on them and to deliver news. Silas Carrington had indeed left the territory, taking the train back to Missouri after paying his court-ordered fine. But Webb had done some digging and discovered something interesting. Carrington's business dealings in St. Louis were under investigation by Missouri authorities for fraud and document forgery unrelated to Clara's case. Apparently, she wasn't the first person he'd tried to manipulate with fake contracts. "The walls are closing in on him," Webb said with satisfaction. "His reputation's taking a beating, and he's got legal troubles of his own now. I doubt he'll risk coming back here." "But he could," Clara said. "He could. But every day that passes makes it less likely. Men like Carrington are ultimately cowards. They prefer easy targets and guaranteed wins. You're neither of those things anymore." On Friday evening, Clara and Jonah sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mesas in shades of copper and gold. The burned barn was an ugly scar on the landscape, but tomorrow it would begin its transformation into something new. "I've been thinking," Clara said carefully, "about what comes after the barn is rebuilt." "What do you mean?" "I mean the ranch, our partnership, what we're building here." She turned to face him. "When I answered your letter, I thought I was coming to help you survive. But this is becoming something more than survival, isn't it?" Jonah was quiet for a moment, considering. "Yes," he said finally. "It is." "Do you regret that? Regret that it got complicated?" "No." He met her eyes. "I regret that you had to go through what you did with Carrington. I regret losing the barn. But I don't regret you being here. I don't regret us." The word hung in the air. Us. Such a small word for such a large reality. "I don't regret it either," Clara said softly. "I came here expecting to work hard and stay invisible. Instead, I found something I didn't know I needed." "What's that?" "A partner who sees me as an equal, a place that feels like it could become home, a future that's mine to choose instead of one that's forced on me." She paused. "And maybe, eventually, something more than partnership." Jonah's breath caught. "Clara, I'm not asking for promises," she said quickly. "I know we're still learning each other. I know your heart has scars and mine does too, but I want you to know that I'm here by choice now. Not just because it's safer than running, and not just because of the legal protection. I'm here because I want to be." Jonah reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I told myself after Sarah died that I'd never let anyone close again. The caring that much and losing it was too high a price. But you walked into my life and reminded me that living without risk is just another kind of dying. I don't want to replace what you lost. You couldn't. Sarah was Sarah, and what we had was real and precious. But it's also past." He squeezed her hand gently. "You're present. You're here, real and solid and brave as hell. And I'm starting to think maybe the heart can hold more than one truth at a time. That I can honor what was while still building what is." Clara felt something break open in her chest, something that had been locked tight since the moment Silas first threatened her back in Missouri. It wasn't love yet. That would take time, would need to be earned through seasons and shared struggles. But it was the beginning of love, the first green shoots pushing through hard ground. "Then we build together," she said. "Together," Jonah agreed. Saturday dawned clear and perfect, the kind of day that made people glad to be alive and working in open air. The crew arrived at first light. Dutch Morrison and his carpenters, Minister Callahan and several men from his congregation, Marshal Tate, and a handful of off-duty deputies, even some of the merchants from Tombstone who'd closed their shops for the day to help. Ellen Tate and Mrs. Hendricks came too, along with other women who set up a cooking station and spent the day feeding the workers. The ranch, which had been so quiet and isolated for so long, suddenly rang with voices and laughter and the sound of hammers striking nails. Jonah worked alongside the crew, his expertise in building evident in the way he directed the framing and ensured everything was square and solid. Clara helped where she could, hauling water, organizing tools, holding lumber steady while it was cut, and spent time with the women, learning their stories and sharing her own. Mrs. Hendricks, it turned out, had come to Arizona as a mail-order bride herself 30 years earlier. "Scariest thing I ever did," she said, kneading bread dough with strong hands. "Left everything I knew to marry a stranger. But it worked out. Tom's been gone 5 years now, but we had a good life together. Built it from nothing, same as you're doing." Were you afraid? Clara asked. Terrified. But I was more afraid of staying where I was, in a city that had nothing for me but factory work and poverty. At least here, I had a chance at something better. She shaped the dough into loaves with practiced efficiency. You made the right choice, Clara, not just in coming, but in fighting back when that man tried to claim you. Women need to see that we can fight, that we don't have to accept being owned. By midday, the barn's frame was taking shape, strong posts rising from the stone foundation, beams connecting them, the skeleton of something that would soon provide shelter and storage. Dutch Morrison called a break for lunch, and everyone gathered in the yard to eat and rest. Jonah found Clara sitting with a group of women, listening to Ellen Tate describe the political fights she'd waged to get a school established in Tombstone. He caught her eye, and Clara excused herself, joining him on the porch. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Good. Tired, but good." He looked at the barn, at the people working to build it, at the evidence of community that had appeared seemingly overnight. "I keep thinking about how different this is from the last time I built that barn. Then it was just me. Took months of working alone. Now, with help, we'll have it finished in weeks. That's what community does." I'd forgotten, or maybe I never really knew. He turned to her. "Thank you for reminding me. I didn't do anything. You did everything. You showed up, fought back, and made people remember why any of this matters. You gave them something to believe in." Before Clara could respond, Dutch Morrison called everyone back to work. The afternoon passed in steady labor, walls going up, roof beams being fitted, the structure growing more solid and real with each passing hour. By the time the sun started its descent, the barn was nearly complete, lacking only the roof panels and some interior work that could be finished in the coming week. The crew stood back, admiring their work. What had been a charred ruin that morning was now a sturdy building, better than the original, built with care and community support. "That's a good day's work," Dutch said with satisfaction. "We'll come back next Saturday, finish the roof, and do the detail work. But the hard part's done." People began packing up their tools and heading home, each one stopping to shake Jonah's hand or hug Clara to offer encouragement and friendship. By the time the last wagon rolled away, the ranch was quiet again, but it felt different, less isolated, more connected to the wider world. Clara and Jonah stood together in the yard, looking at the new barn silhouetted against the sunset sky. "We should celebrate," Clara said. "How?" "I don't know. Something special. Something that marks this as a turning point." Jonah thought for a moment, then disappeared into the house. He returned carrying a bottle of whiskey, old, dusty, clearly saved for a significant occasion. "This was my father's," he said. "Only good thing he left me. I've been saving it for something that mattered." He poured 2 small glasses, handed one to Clara, and raised his own. "To new beginnings," he said. "To partnership," Clara added. "To surviving and rebuilding. To choosing each other." They drank, the whiskey burning warm and smooth, and stood together watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The desert stretched around them, vast and challenging, but no longer quite so lonely. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Clara had never experienced before. Hard work balanced by genuine partnership, challenges met together, small victories celebrated as they came. The barn was completed, better than before, and they filled it with new tools purchased with money Jonah had been saving and contributions from townspeople who insisted on helping. The garden recovered from the drought, producing vegetables that Clara learned to preserve for winter. The cattle fattened on the grass that had come back after the storm. The well stayed full, and the land began to look less like it was dying and more like it was simply being tested. Clara found herself becoming part of Tombstone's community in ways she'd never expected. The women who'd helped during the barn raising became friends, real friends, who invited her to church socials and quilting circles and shared their own stories of survival and strength. Ellen Tate became a particular confidant, a woman who understood what it meant to build a life in hard country and to stand up for what mattered. Jonah, too, began to emerge from the isolation he'd wrapped around himself after Sarah's death. Men who'd ignored him for years now nodded in greeting, asked his opinion on livestock and weather, included him in the informal networks that made frontier life survivable. He was still quiet, still more comfortable with work than words, but the walls he'd built were crumbling. And between Clara and Jonah, something was growing. Not rushed, not forced, but steady and real. They worked side by side during the days, shared meals and conversation in the evenings, and at night they lay in the same bed, the space between them gradually shrinking as trust deepened into something more tender. One evening in late October, as the first cool winds of autumn swept down from the mountains, they were working together to repair a section of fence when Clara paused, looking at the land around them. "I love it here," she said, surprised by the realization. Jonah straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yeah? Yeah, it's hard, and it's not always pretty, and there are days I want to scream at the stubbornness of it all. But it's honest. The land doesn't pretend to be something it's not. It just is what it is, and you either accept that and work with it, or you don't survive. That's the truth of the desert. And I think it's the truth of us too." Clara set down her tools, turning to face him fully. "We didn't pretend to be something we weren't. We were honest about our scars, about what we needed, about what we could offer. And because of that honesty, we built something real." Jonah moved closer, his dark eyes holding hers. "Clara, I need to tell you something." "What?" "I'm falling in love with you. Maybe have been for weeks, but I didn't want to rush it, didn't want to assume—" He stopped, searching for words. "I know we married for practical reasons. I know this started as partnership, nothing more. But it's become more for me, and I need you to know that. I need you to have the choice of what happens next." Clara felt her heart swell, felt tears sting her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of hearing words she'd been afraid to hope for. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "Have been since you gave me space to choose, since you stood beside me in court, since you showed me what partnership really means." Jonah cupped her face gently in his calloused hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had spilled over. "Then maybe we should stop calling this a marriage of convenience and start calling it what it's becoming." "What's that?" "A real marriage, built on choice and respect, and something that feels an awful lot like love." Clara smiled through her tears. "I like the sound of that." He kissed her then, not the brief chaste kiss from their wedding, but something deeper, something that spoke of promises kept and futures chosen. Clara wrapped her arms around him, kissing him back, and felt the last of her fear and doubt burn away like morning frost under desert sun. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jonah rested his forehead against hers. "I want to show you something," he said. He took her hand and led her to the hill behind the house, to the spot where two graves lay beneath the dying cottonwood. Clara had never been up here before, had given Jonah the privacy he needed with his grief. "Sarah and the baby are here," Jonah said quietly. "I haven't been able to visit much. It hurt too much, reminded me of everything I'd lost." "We don't have to—" "I want to." He knelt by the graves, brushing away dried leaves. "Sarah, this is Clara. She's my wife now. I think you'd like her. She's brave and stubborn, and she doesn't let me get away with shutting people out." He paused, voice thick. "I'm going to love her. I'm going to build a life with her. And I need you to know that doesn't mean I'm forgetting you or what we had. It just means I'm learning to live again." Clara knelt beside him, placing her hand over his. Together they sat in the fading light, honoring the past while choosing the future, making space for grief and joy to coexist. Winter came to the Arizona territory, cold and clear and beautiful in its starkness. The ranch thrived under Clara and Jonah's joint stewardship. The rebuilt barn weathered the storms perfectly. The cattle made it through to spring healthy and strong, and the well never faltered. News arrived in February through a letter from Garrett Webb. Silas Carrington had been arrested in Missouri on multiple counts of fraud and forgery. The investigation that had started with his business dealings had expanded to include his treatment of Clara and at least 3 other women he'd attempted to coerce through fake contracts. He was awaiting trial, his reputation in ruins, his business empire collapsing. Clara read the letter aloud to Jonah over morning coffee, then carefully folded it and placed it in the stove, watching it burn. "It's over," she said. "It's over," Jonah agreed. Spring arrived like a benediction, the desert exploding into color as dormant plants erupted into bloom. Clara planted a garden 3 times the size of the original, ambitious and confident in her ability to make things grow. Jonah expanded the cattle herd, his finances finally stable enough to invest in the ranch's future. And one warm April evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mesas in shades of rose and gold, Clara placed her hand over her stomach and smiled. "Jonah," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her, saw the expression on her face, and his breath caught. Yes, I think so. It's early still, but I'm fairly certain." Jonah pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her as his face pressed against her hair. She felt him shaking and realized he was crying, not from grief this time, but from joy and hope and the overwhelming relief of being given a second chance at something he'd thought was lost forever. "Are you happy?" Clara asked, needing to hear him say it. "I'm terrified," Jonah admitted. "But yes, I'm happy. So damn happy." "Me too." They sat together as night fell, making plans and dreaming futures. Two people who'd started as strangers and become partners and then lovers, and now, soon, parents. The desert stretched around them, no longer a barrier but a foundation, hard ground that had taught them both what it meant to survive, to fight, to choose each other, despite every reason not to. The ranch that had been failing when Clara arrived was now thriving. The community that had ignored Jonah for years now embraced them both. And the marriage that had begun as legal strategy had become the truest thing either of them had ever known. In December, Clara gave birth to a daughter during the first snowfall of winter. They named her Sarah Hope Redfeather, Sarah for the woman who'd come before, hope for what the future held. Jonah held his daughter with shaking hands, tears streaming down his weathered face, while Clara watched from the bed with exhausted joy. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's ours," Clara said. By the time little Sarah was 6 months old, the ranch had become a gathering place. The barn raising had started something, a tradition of community support and collective building that spread throughout the territory. When neighboring ranches needed help, Jonah and Clara were there. When women in Tombstone faced threats or coercion, Clara stood with them, helping them find legal support and safe options. The story of the woman who'd stood up to Silas Carrington became legend, told and retold, inspiring others to fight back against injustice. Clara never sought the attention, but she accepted it as responsibility, understanding that her victory mattered beyond just her own freedom. On their second wedding anniversary, Jonah took Clara back to the church where they'd married. Minister Callahan was there, along with Marshall Tate and Ellen, Mrs. Hendricks and Dutch Morrison, and dozens of others who'd become family over the past 2 years. "We've already had a wedding," Clara said, confused. "We had a legal ceremony," Jonah corrected. "This time, I want to marry you because I love you, because I choose you every day, not out of necessity, but out of desire, because you're my partner, my wife, the mother of my child, and the person I want to spend the rest of my life building something beautiful with." Clara's eyes filled with tears as Jonah pulled out new rings. Not the plain gold bands they'd bought in haste, but carefully crafted pieces with small stones set in silver, made by a craftsman in Tombstone who owed them both a debt of gratitude. They exchanged vows again, this time with their daughter in Clara's arms, this time with absolute certainty, this time with a community that had become family bearing witness. And when Minister Callahan pronounced them husband and wife for the second time, when Jonah kissed Clara with all the love he'd learned to feel again, when Sarah Hope giggled and reached for her father's face, the desert itself seemed to celebrate, the wind carrying the sound of joy across red rock mesas and endless sky. Years passed, measured in seasons and harvests, in children born and raised, in droughts survived and storms weathered. The ranch grew prosperous, not wealthy but stable, providing a good life for the family that tended it. Clara's garden became legendary, producing vegetables that thrived despite the harsh climate. Jonah's cattle operation expanded, his reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spreading throughout the territory. They had 2 more children, a son they named Thomas, after Clara's father, and another daughter named Ellen, after the woman who'd become Clara's dearest friend. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, rooms added with care and craftsmanship, each one filled with laughter and love. The graves on the hill were tended regularly now, wildflowers planted around them each spring. Jonah visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Clara and the children, telling Sarah, the first Sarah, about the life he'd built, about the woman who'd saved him from his own isolation, about the family that had grown from loss and choice and stubborn hope. Tombstone evolved around them, the silver boom ending but the town surviving, transforming from wild frontier outpost into something more settled and civilized. Clara became involved in establishing a school, serving on the board and ensuring that girls received the same education as boys. Jonah joined the Territorial Cattlemen's Association, his voice respected, his mixed heritage no longer a barrier to participation. And through it all, through every challenge and celebration, Clara and Jonah stood together, partners in the truest sense, equals who'd chosen each other freely and continued choosing each other through every season of their lives. On their 10th anniversary, they stood on the porch at sunset, watching their children play in the yard. Sarah Hope, now a fierce and independent 9-year-old, was teaching her younger siblings how to track animals in the dust. The new barn stood solid and strong. The garden was lush with late summer vegetables. The land that had once been dying now teemed with life. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked quietly. "Answering my letter? Bringing me here?" Jonah looked at her, this woman who'd transformed his life, and smiled. "Every single day." Clara's eyes widened in shock, but Jonah pulled her close, laughing. "I regret that I didn't find you sooner, that we wasted years being alone when we could have been together, that you had to suffer Carrington's harassment before finding your way here." He kissed her forehead gently. "But regret bringing you here? Regret building this life?" "Never. Not for 1 second." Clara relaxed into his embrace, watching the sun paint the mesas in fire and gold, listening to her children's laughter, feeling the solid warmth of the man who'd become her partner in every sense that mattered. The desert had brought her home. The law had set her free. And love, real, hard-won, chosen love, had given her a life worth fighting for. She thought about the woman she'd been in Missouri, desperate and hunted, convinced she'd never find safety or belonging. That woman would barely recognize the person Clara had become, strong, rooted, surrounded by family and community, no longer defined by what she'd fled, but by what she'd built. "I love you," she told Jonah. "I love you too," he replied. "Always have, always will." The sun set over the Arizona Territory, painting the world in shades of promise and possibility. The ranch that had nearly died was thriving. The community that had been fractured was whole. And two people who'd started as strangers, bound by necessity and defended by law, had built something that would last beyond their own lives. A legacy of partnership and perseverance, of standing up against injustice, of choosing love over fear. The desert had tested them both, had demanded everything they had to give. And they'd answered that demand not just with survival, but with growth, transformation, and the kind of deep-rooted strength that came from knowing exactly who you were and choosing exactly where you belonged. Clara Redfeather stood on her porch with her husband's arm around her waist, her children playing in the yard, and felt the truth settle in her bones. She was home. Not because the land was easy or the life was soft, but because she'd fought for this place, this family, this future. And in the end, that's what made it worth everything. The stars came out one by one, ancient and constant, watching over a ranch where freedom had been won, love had been chosen, and two broken people had learned to make each other whole.